So, I'm a French student, and I study at a university in the UK. It's a campus university, meaning that the university and all its affiliated buildings are centered in an area outside of the city. As a second-year student, I live in the nearest town to the campus, which is about 20 minutes away by bus and car. The town I live in is relatively nice, even though the north part is much nicer and safer than the south. My 7 roommates and I live in a 10-bedroom house on the north side. Even though it's a relatively nice town, it's known for sketchy people sometimes hanging anywhere around, and there's an alarming amount of crime for such a small place. However, I was never too worried, until now. A couple of weeks ago, I was coming home from a coffee date with a friend of mine. I was on my way home, across the street to my doorstep, and as I was pulling my keys out of my pocket, a man interrupted me. I turned around to see the man standing right behind me. He was probably 5'10" or something, around 23 years old, and wasn't too built, honestly. At first, I thought he was a delivery man, because one of my roommates was expecting an Amazon order that she had asked me to get for her. He started to talk, though. "Sorry for bothering you. I saw you walking from over there, crossing the street. You have something quite attractive in your walk." At this point, I just assumed he was some rando trying to flirt with me. He then asked me, though, "Are you Spanish?" It's a question I get often, and this man didn't look harmful, so I answered honestly, "No, I'm French." He then tried to engage in a conversation with me by asking me how long I'd been in the UK for, why I speak English so well, and what I study. At this point, I just thought it was super sketchy, so I was half answering his questions, desperately wanted to get inside my damn house. Suddenly, though, the man blurted out, "Is this a house of all girls?" This is what alarmed me. Why would he even just ask that to some random person? So I replied with the truth once again. "No, there are 4 boys and 4 girls." He seemed quite unsettled, and asked if I know his friend that used to live there last year. I just say no. He suddenly says he'll leave me to it, and take care, have a good day, and finishes with, "I'll see you soon." I'm not one to panic easily, but when I came home, I immediately went to my roommates, let's call them Brooke and Maya, to tell them what happened. As I finished my story, Maya looks at Brooke, and then back at me. I just knew something was up. Then Maya tells me, "So 2 days ago I was coming back from the store, right? And I could sense that someone was following me. At some point he came up to me. He matched exactly the description from the guy who was just here." Maya, Brooke, and I were plain worried at this point. He wanted to talk to me and wouldn't listen when I asked him to leave me alone because I have a boyfriend. He left once I got home and shut the door in his face. This meant that this man, assuming it was the same one, followed Mia to his house, and he was also hanging around this place when I came home. When the 4 boys arrived back, we told them all about what happened, just to make sure that if anything were to occur to us, there was a backstory. Every time I go out of the house and come back, I looked to see if the man was still around. We never saw him again, though, until a couple of days ago. We received an alert from the Students' Union saying that a young woman had disappeared in the south of town. They suspected a kidnapping, so they were urging everyone to be careful. We didn't hear much about it for a couple of days, until they found the woman's body near the riverside one morning. A couple of hours later, they caught the man who had done it and released his picture to the public. It was that same man who had been at my doorstep. I think it hasn't entirely sunk in what happened, or in this case, didn't happen to me. But it's still disturbing to know that that poor woman could have been me, or even one of my roommates. Even though the man has been caught, I still look around my block whenever I leave home, or when I come home as well. Never been more thankful for being naturally over-paranoid by Emotional C. So a couple of things I'd like to pre-posit before getting into the story. I lived in one house my whole childhood. On the surface, it looked like the stereotypical child-friendly neighborhood situated right next to a small park. This was very much not the case, however. When I was maybe 5 or 7, young but still old enough to be in school, 2 assholes attempted to kidnap many kids walking home from school around that park area. They were never caught, and the same white van was confirmed to be around the area many years later, after another kid reported just having barely escaped a kidnapping. As I got older, I realized more and more how super not kid-friendly this neighborhood was. Sketchy neighbors, fights breaking out into the street causing cops to be called often, gang members who literally just broke shit and did drugs made the back paths through the dense neighborhoods and woods their home. They were such a problem that the police had to be called so often they blocked off those back trails in an attempt to get them to leave. The kidnapping incident made tiny me one paranoid motherfucker. Probably watching shows like Criminal Minds and Law & Order from a young age didn't help either. This is probably for the best though, because although I try to be as cautious as possible and keep to myself, crazy shit just keeps happening around me. One of the scariest things that's ever happened to me was when I was much older, probably 17 or so. I would get home from high school at around 2:15 or so, since I lived a maybe 5-minute drive away from the school. My parents, however, didn't get home until 7 or 8 o'clock at night most days, meaning I had the house all to myself for many hours each day. I religiously locked the front door, garage, and back door any time I'm home alone. This would piss my parents off since they would have to rummage for their keys in the dark, unless it was the middle of summer where I live. It gets dark way before they get home, especially during the dead of winter, before they could get into their own damn house. I understood what their frustration was, but leaving the door unlocked made me so anxious that I spent the entire time with a pit in my stomach. I'm a small and probably easily pick-upable person, and at the time I owned no real way of self-defense aside from a knife from the kitchen. I was positive that if someone wanted to kidnap or kill me or whatever, all they had to do was get inside and I'd be totally defenseless. The only thing keeping me safe was that locked door. One last thing to note is that at my mother's house, we had 2 dogs, both corgis, and they would bark at anything that moved in front of our house. Often this would be long before anyone would see the person or car go past. On this day I got home and didn't lock the door. The day before I got ripped a new one for forgetting to unlock it before a parent figure got home. Immediately after I get home, I go straight to the main computer to start my homework and watch YouTube and shit. From this spot you can turn 90 degrees to the left and stare straight at the front door. The back door is also like a foot away from you just on the right. Right next to the front door was the garage door. Due to the small kitchen we had, basically all of the foodstuffs was in the garage. It didn't matter what I went in there for, but as I closed the garage door behind me, I had this overwhelming feeling that I needed to lock the front door right now. It wasn't the usual anxiety, but an overwhelming feeling of pure dread. I ran and locked the door without even a second thought, and attempted to go on with my business. Moments later, the good fluffy friends needed to go outside for a moment. We have a reasonably large backyard, so once they're outside, they'll spend a while out there playing and sniffing the same tree for 15 to 20 minutes. On theme with the other coincidences, I had paused the video I was watching to get up and do something. I don't really remember what anymore. The dogs were still outside, and because of that, they didn't bark at whoever had walked up to my front door and gently knocked on it. There was no way I would have heard it unless the house was completely silent, which conveniently enough it just happened to be. This obviously got my attention, and I froze. I couldn't believe what I saw next. The doorknob was obviously being shook as they attempted to open the door. After maybe 30 seconds, the shaking stopped and never started again. I owned a car that was parked outside my house. I feel like that means it was very obvious someone was home. I don't know if they thought maybe no one was home, knocked to see if they heard any noise inside, then tried the door once they thought the coast was clear, or if they were just after me. I just about pissed myself. As quietly as I could, I made my dogs come back in. The back gate's door could easily be opened, and I'm sure they would try to come in that way after. I locked the back door, put a piece of wood behind the sliding door, closed the blinds, and held the dogs like these 15 to 25-pound dogs were going to protect me from everything. After some time, I attempted to return to my business, and for some stupid reason, I didn't call the police or even my parents. I just told them about it when they got home from work that day. I never heard any shit for keeping the door locked after that. I've moved out into my own flat, and I still can't shake the dread of wondering what could have happened if I didn't lock the door, and if the dogs hadn't wanted to go out at that moment. If they were inside the house, they would have barked up a storm covering up the sound of the knocking and the doorknob moving, and I would have never actually had a clue what would have happened. I still lock the front door no matter what to this day. When I was 13, I broke my leg in a nasty bicycle incident. I ended up in a plaster cast from my hip to my ankle for about 8 weeks. As it was coming up to Christmas, my younger brother wanted to go to the theater to see the Christmas show. I was 13, moody, and accompanied by a bright pink cast now everywhere I went. I was really not feeling it. My dad, never one for going to the theater anyway, offered to take me with him to Pizza Hut instead. It was a rare opportunity to spend time with my dad, who was often working very long hours. He worked as a police officer, which, at the time, I didn't really take too much of an interest in what he did. We had a pretty great evening at Pizza Hut, and got back into the car to go home with full bellies and some leftover pizzas. I remember just babbling away to my dad, as I had been the whole night, enthralled that I had his undivided attention. After a while, though, I began to notice that he wasn't really responding anymore. We were fairly close by home, but still on the main roads before we turned off towards our housing estate. At first, I thought he'd just lost interest in the conversation, but as I glanced across, I noticed he was now permanently looking into the rear view mirror. I asked him what was up, and he said, "The car behind us. It's followed us all the way from Pizza Hut." I glanced behind and commented that we were still on the main roads. I couldn't really see that this was an unusual route for this guy to take. "Well, I need to see whether he is. I don't want to lead this guy to our house." I rolled my eyes. My dad was always so paranoid about stuff like this. We couldn't even tell friends we were going away on holiday, because he was just convinced the house would be broken into while we were away. We were coming up to a residential area just before ours that I knew from doing a newspaper round. I suggested the street coming up on the left, as it looped around in a horseshoe shape to a housing estate and brought you back out to the same exact main road we were on, just a little bit further up. Nobody would ever take this road to come out onto the main road again. My dad turned off onto the road, and so did the car. I'll never forget that feeling, that sinking feeling, as I watched the car sharply turn to get behind ours. The car placed its full beams on. I let out a gasp and looked towards my dad. He'd gone into work mode. He had completely shut me out. He accelerated down the street, and as we came to the main road, I saw there were many cars still there. He pulled straight out onto the main road, meaning the car coming onto the main road needed to brake sharply, and held down their horn at us. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, breathing deeply as my dad weaved in and out of the lanes. A part of me was completely terrified, and another part of me was still convinced this couldn't really be happening, that he had somehow exaggerated or mistaken this. He couldn't possibly be following us. I dared to look in the side mirror and saw there was a different car behind us. I felt myself relax a little. We turned left at the coming roundabout, giving very little room to anyone, and a few moments of holding my breath thinking we were going to hear the sound of metal on metal. The street we had turned onto was slightly quieter than the road previous. I slowly glanced into the side mirror. It was still a different car behind us. I sighed in relief and thought this had really just been my dad's imagination. Suddenly, though, the rear-view mirror became completely illuminated again, and I awkwardly turned in my seat to see a car pull out sharply from behind the car behind us and pull in quickly behind ours again. I looked towards my dad. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and told me to call someone in particular in his phone and put it on speaker. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. A cheerful voice answered, and before he could say anything else, my dad quickly summarized what had happened. There was a pause, and I could hear voices speaking in the background, radios, beeping and the answering of radios. My dad barked at me to keep naming the streets we were on to the man on the phone, as my dad randomly turned down different ones, trying to stick to the main roads. The whole time I was randomly calling names and trying to remember to say the direction we were heading. The car was so close behind us and completely blinding any view behind. All I could think was, please don't hit us. If we crash, I can't run. What the hell could I do? My leg had only just been plastered. I knew I stood no chance. I suddenly wondered if they were getting close enough to take a shot at us. This, for me, was unthinkable. It was England. That was not the norm. Why the hell would someone want to do that? We continued to weave down streets in random turns as I was tossed around the front seat, clutching on to the mobile in my trembling hands. The voice on the phone shouted, "Turn into the Tesco car park that's coming up on the left. We have 3 response vehicles coming from the other direction." My dad sharply turned into the car park, skipping the red light. I shut my eyes, again waiting for the sound of metal on metal. As we swung into the near-empty car park, the car behind us in close pursuit, blue lights surrounded our car from what felt like all directions. The sound of sirens was deafening. My dad hopped straight out of the car and ran behind. I screamed, still thinking someone could have a gun, and tried to look over to see when my door swung open. A police officer was crouching into the car to help me get out. My arms were completely jelly. I couldn't even use the crutches to help me stand. Another officer came, and between them, they helped me as I hopped on the back of the police car. They were very kind and tried to distract me as I was trying to see what was going on and where my dad was. I couldn't really see anything from my angle, and I also couldn't turn properly due to my leg. They did their best to reassure me, and the one that had clearly just been through the nearby McDonald's drive-thru offered me his tea. I sobbed, begging them to tell me what was going on. My dad, after some time, came over to the car and told them to take me home. He had checked, and my mom was back home with my brother. As the police car turned around in the car park, back towards the entrance, we could see the police surrounding the vehicle, and 3 men in what looked to be their late 20s were handcuffed, leaning over the car whilst a sniffer dog and 2 police officers were taking things out, one of which was a baseball bat. When my dad got home later that night, I asked him what it was all about. Who the hell were these men, and why were they following us? He was very reluctant to tell me anything. He did admit, though, that it was because of him that they were following us. He explained that he was in a drugs team that dealt with, how I understand this as an adult, the interception of large shipments of drugs that were to be transferred across the country, and sometimes people lost a lot of money when they got caught. I just stared at him. I had no idea what to say. He just shrugged and said, "Sometimes, people get really upset about that. So, dear drug lords whom my father took drugs or money from, I'd rather not meet again." I've been debating on posting this, not because I've been scared, but simply because this is my first post since joining Reddit. And please forgive my writing, as sometimes my wording and punctuation could stand to be a little bit better. I'll start off by explaining the area, so you can get a good picture of where this all occurred. At the time, we lived in a small neighborhood. All of the surrounding streets dead-end into a half-circle park. Behind the park are some woods, and a railroad track going off into the distance. When we were a lot younger, we all played in the front part of the woods. We never ventured too far back. This was our play area for years, and we had never had an issue or a scare. This area was an extremely beautiful and well-lit wooded area. Anyhow, one day my brother Jimmy, my best friend Sarah, and my brother's best friend Ian were all building a dam in the middle of the small creek that ran through the park and woods. The boys decided they wanted to head back for a moment to Ian's house for some snacks. Sarah and I said we would stay and finish setting up our camp area. As we were moving rocks around, though, I suddenly had a very odd feeling come over me. A strange feeling that we were being watched. I immediately thought it was the boys trying to scare us, and just continued with what we were doing. Sarah and I load up some big rocks and head back to the creek and put them down at the dam. As we're doing so, though, I get that feeling again. I stand up, and I see something straight in front of me, only about 30 feet away. I couldn't clearly make out what it was yet, because it was hidden behind a bush, but I did see that it was a pattern of red and blue. I know that's nothing the boys had on them, so at this point, I was focusing really hard trying to figure out what it was. As I was scanning up the bush, I slowly started to realize it was a clown. I shit you not, my heart started pounding immediately. My eyes locked with the clown's. He was wearing a blue and red hat with a reverse patterned red and blue jumpsuit. I grabbed Sarah's shirt and immediately pulled her upright. She noticed the man right away. He was smiling with his full face of clown makeup, and he was holding a large knife. We both said nothing and started running as fast as our legs could take us. He began to follow. We could hear twigs snapping and the ground crunching behind us, but we were booking it. We ran through the front of the woods, through the side of the park, and up her dead-end street. Ian and Jimmy are 2 houses up from the end and saw us running. They started yelling to us, asking what was going on. While running past, we screamed about the clown, and they all started laughing at us. We were still running, screaming for our lives, and finally made it to the middle of the street where Sarah's dad, Danny, was now running out the front door because he could hear our screaming. We met Danny right at the beginning of the neighbor's house, and were trying to explain what we had seen. "Girls, stop it now. This is ridiculous. What are you talking about?" We tried to catch our breath. By the time Jimmy and Ian had caught up to us, we were crying and pointing and trying to tell Danny again that we had seen a clown with a knife. Jimmy and Ian were laughing, and Danny was asking us if they had played a prank on us. About this time, though, a yellow Pinto type of car comes from the dead end at the park and pulls right up next to the sidewalk of the yard we were in. Sure enough, plain as day, it was the clown. No hat this time, but knife in hand, telling us to walk over. Danny started shoving us all towards the house, and he himself was scared and running now. The car drove off down the street quickly. We went inside right away, and Danny called the police. We had to give statements, and the police patrolled the neighborhood and the park for a few weeks after. We were never allowed to go in that park again, and a few months after that, the city started to clear out the woods, cut down many trees, and made a walking area that you could see through all the way to the train tracks. My friend and I used to talk about this many times up until her untimely death. No one would ever believe us had they not seen it as well. It was just so terrifying. I think they only got to see him because whoever it was had to go down to the dead-end street to leave the neighborhood. Either way, this man was not afraid of us, nor the small group of people that had gathered from our screaming. He bravely stopped right in front of us as her father tried to comfort us and calm us all down, all whilst flashing his knife. I feel we're lucky to be alive. Had it just been one of us left in the woods, which sometimes occurred, I don't think there would have been a group of 4 of us any longer. Sarah's dad decided to stop drinking that day as well. We all developed a fear of clowns after.